Yeah, like I said, it's always kind of weird to talk about fasting so much after lunch, but I've done it. I've done it enough, and it's a topic I care very, very passionately about. This is a topic that I've become a subject matter expert. I regularly appear on podcasts and different shows. I go to conferences to talk about it, and I strive to live it out very fully. And it can be quite hard, too, considering I run multiple marathons a year, and the fact that I try to and still do all this excessive fasting can be hard, but some of the greatest things in life don't come easy. They come with perseverance, and they come through sacrifice. And that is why we're all called, in a certain sense, to make sacrifice for our students. And that is why we're here today, to talk about fasting, to talk about abstinence. I wrote a book on this. I have a couple copies left, but I will say, as I've given this book to priests before, very good priests, very knowledgeable priests, many of which told me that 95% of it was new to them. So you are not alone if you're like, I didn't know about a lot of this. Because people feel like it doesn't need to be taught because it's not relevant, it's history. You don't have to go over all these historical things. Let's just worry about what we do now, people say. But what I'm going to share with you is a robust degree of fasting and abstinence that was so foundational and so important that if you didn't fast, you really couldn't be a Christian. That it was as essential as Sunday Mass, that if you did not abstain on Friday, that the thought that you would not, or on other days throughout the year, was so scandalous that it was considered an attack on our Lord himself. But why is modern man so averse to fasting? And why do so few people fast today? When did this change? And how can we restore this in our lives, in our families, in our parishes, and importantly, offer it up in reparation for our own sins, for those of our family or friends, for our own parish priests, for our diocese, for our nation, and for our students. So those are the ideas I'm going to leave you with today, with a history of the collapse of fasting and abstinence. And one thing I want you to take away is that true Christian fasting is much harder than any Islamic fasting you'll hear about. People praise Islam for fasting hard, but they're nothing compared to regular Catholic fasting. Because in many respects, what they do is a sprint, what we do is a marathon. And it was practiced with great devotion and love because our Lord himself willed it and he observed it. So today, our objectives are to understand a brief history of fasting and abstinence in the church. You might think it's quite robust, but it's really just a brief amount, because I've spent years on this research that I compiled in the second edition of my book. We're also going to recognize how important fasting and abstinence was for the life of Catholic for over 2,000 years, and how it's still instrumentally important, fasting and abstinence. They're two different laws. They apply at different ages and different circumstances. We lump them together, but they are distinct, closely related, but they are distinct. And lastly, and somewhat most importantly, we're going to plan additional days of fasting and abstinence based upon our robust Catholic tradition so we can voluntarily offer it up for the good of our diocese, parish, family, students, and our own salvation. And that's going to be your activity today. We're going to be doing a little bit of research, and you're going to be coming up with a plan of who to fast for and when to fast for them. But you need to understand first what we've lost before we dive into this. Every year I make a calendar. This is a picture of it. I also publish a digital download for people to buy, and you can add to your phones. So in case you have like an iPhone, you can add your calendar there. You can add your Google Calendar. You can add it to Outlook, anything. But I also just published this graphic for people to download. And you don't have to worry about the key so much right now, but if there's a date highlighted, and you have this in your notes in front of you, that was a day of penance in some respect. So what we have gone from is 2/3 of the year as a Catholic, you could not eat meat. So that burger today was special for many of our ancestors, because this was only 1/3 of the year you were allowed to eat meat. And 1/3 of the year was fasting. That is how robust a life our ancestors practiced fasting until, in some respects, relatively modern times, here even in the United States, our own history has been lost. But before I go over the history of American fasting, which I think is quite fascinating because most people have just a rudimentary understanding of it. You might hear stories from grandparents who remember this day or that. What we really understand is we understand history in its context. Those were just vestiges of a bygone era, the last remnants that remain from the devotion of our forefathers. In the beginning, in principio, that is when fasting started, because you could say fasting is a commandment not just from the church, but from God himself. Because the very first commandment of God was not written on the Ten Commandments. It was given to Adam and Eve in the garden, where he told them to fast from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The first commandment of God was one of fasting and abstinence, and mankind failed. Their failure to observe those laws brought about disorder and sin. Their sin was that of not only pride, but also gluttony, since they actually ate of the forbidden fruit. And both are intricately tied to fasting, and fasting is a remedy for both of those, amongst many other things as well. But also in the beginning, both Elijah and Moses fasted for 40 days in the Old Testament before they saw God. And until the great flood, and Noah persevered through that flood, man abstained entirely from the flesh meat of animals. Noah was the very first person in human history who could eat meat when God gave him permission after the flood to do so. Beforehand, animals were not raised for meat. They were raised perhaps for wool or for other uses, but not for slaughter. He was the first person to eat meat. St. John the Baptist, the greatest of all the prophets, fasted, and his followers were characterized by their fasting. But perhaps most important of all, our blessed Lord himself fasted for 40 days in the desert, not of his own needs, but to give us an example. Since our Redeemer said, quote, "Unless you do penance, you will likewise perish," end quote. That's Luke 13:3. Fasting and abstinence from certain foods characterize the lives of man since the very foundation of the world, and the Church has hallowed the practice of fasting. It encourages it and it mandates it. Why? Why is it so important? St. Thomas Aquinas delineates the reasons. First, he says, in order to bridle the lusts of the flesh in a society that prizes lust of the eyes, of the flesh, and of human passions and desires, fasting is the primary means we have to counter those, and the Church has always counseled that, as that was the remedy. Secondly, we have recourse to fasting in order that our minds can more freely contemplate heavenly things, he says. Because if you're not worried so much about cooking this and preparing that and cleaning up after this, and you're like, well, we only eat once a day, I have all this extra time in the day, and I don't have to worry about all of that. And third, in order to satisfy for our sins, because we have forgotten the importance of regular penance, that we don't just do the penance after confession we are done. In a society that plunges itself more and more into sin and chaos, we must satisfy for our sins, but also those of our family and our friends, and I will say of our students too. So if we see those struggling, especially if we think that maybe if we look back, we maybe led a student astray, we didn't give them the right answer, we weren't everything we should have been, all the more reason to fast the more. St. Basil the Great also said that the importance of fasting was important because fasting was a protection against demons, and he said our guardian angel stays closer to us in proportion to our fasting. The Baltimore Catechism also echoed these sentiments when it says, the Church commands us to fast and abstain in order that we may mortify our passions and satisfy for our sins. And again, drawing on one of those older catechisms I mentioned, Father Thomas Kincaid, who wrote a catechism in 1891, said, quote, remember that it's our bodies that lead us to sin. Therefore, we must punish the body by fasting and mortification. We atone for the sin, and thus God wipes out a part of the temporal punishment due to it, end quote. That was from the 1891 Catechism by Father Kincaid. And St. Leo the Great also wisely counseled that fasting is always not to be a means to an end, that we don't just fast to fast, that we truly must fast for these heavenly purposes. So fasting is important, and it has been practiced over the centuries. And in fact, it goes back to the very early church. Because as I mentioned earlier, the Catechism and Liturgy, which I think is a great little catechism you should totally download, use, and reference as part of a supplement, it even mentions that fasting goes back to the very time of the apostles themselves for the Lenten fast. But something I'd highlight here in this slide is so important that this is from the rule of St. Benedict, and it's not something to be glanced over. Because St. Benedict wanted his followers, those who obeyed his rule, to love fasting, he said. Not to make do with it, to get by with it, to persevere through it, to overcome it, to fulfill the obligation to be done with it, but to love it. Because in loving it, it was truly a means to appease Almighty God and to save their own souls. So fasting in the early church, the very beginning, what was it like? And it consisted of two primary things, one of which we had the weekly fast. Every single Wednesday and Friday of the year, plus Saturdays in some places, were days of fasting and days of abstinence. And these were the key fasts in the early church. Some places added Saturdays as well. St. Francis de Sales notes this. And something I find interesting is there's an old adage, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. You probably heard that. And do you ever think about where it comes from? It comes from the fact that in the very early church, people in England at the time would go to Rome. And Rome did not observe fasting on Saturdays, but the Romans did. But the Roman Britons did. But the Romans in the city of Rome itself, they're all part of the Roman Empire, did not. And they were counseled, well, in Rome, just do what they do. Fast on their days, basically. And that's where the saying comes from. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. So fasting was heavily localized. So there was regional differences. But in the very early church, every single Wednesday and Friday for the entire church was days of fasting and abstinence. And the Lenten fast was practiced with great devotion as well. The great liturgist Dom Guéranger writes that the fast which preceded Easter, which we know of now as the Lenten fast, originated with the apostles themselves. This is what he says. Quote, "The 40 days fast, which we call Lent, is the Church's preparation for Easter and was instituted at the very commencement of Christianity. Our blessed Lord himself sanctioned it by fasting 40 days and 40 nights in the desert. And though he would not impose it on the world by an express commandment, which in that case could never be open to the power of dispensation, yet he showed plainly enough by his own example that fasting which God had so frequently ordered in the old law was to be practiced by the children of the new. And the apostles therefore legislated for our weakness by instituting at the very commencement of the Christian church that the solemnity of Easter should be preceded by a universal fast," end quote. So there's some important things there. One, he again asserts that the apostles themselves started the Lenten fast. But two, he also notes that it was our Lord's kindness towards us that he allowed the apostles themselves, because we'll find out how the fasting should be practiced is quite robust. And he wanted to give the power to the apostles and their successors to dispense from certain people in certain situations. So if he made it a law in the same way that the Ten Commandments were a law, they wouldn't be able to do so. Because nobody can dispense from the Ten Commandments. You can't go to your priest, you can't go to the bishop, you can't go to the Pope and say, well, I don't want to observe the first commandment, I want to worship idols. I want to give me a dispensation. That doesn't exist. Same thing, too, with the third commandment. Bishops might have power to dispense from the precept of attending Mass on certain days, even Sundays. But that doesn't mean that you're not having to observe the holiness of the Lord's Day and rest from servile work. So there's an important distinction. So he's getting at that distinction right there. Now, in the 2nd century, St. Irenaeus wrote to Pope St. Victor inquiring how Easter should be celebrated, and he mentioned the practice of fasting leading up to Easter. Initially, that Lenten fast was practiced by catechumens who were preparing for their baptism, and a universal fast for all the faithful observed was only taking place during Holy Week, in addition to those weekly fasts that were devotionally practiced. But early on, all the baptized Christians began to see all these catechumens fasting in this period of preparation leading up to Easter, and they wanted to join in. So the duration of the fast varied, with some churches observing 1 day, others several days, until it became understood that there was to be a fasting of a period that we know of as Lent for a certain period of time leading up to Easter. It should also be noted that in the very early church, the 40-hour fast was also practiced with great austerity in honor of our blessed Lord. He was in the tomb for 40 hours. So there was a specific kind of fasting you would have called the Passion Fast over those 40 hours, and we'll have more information on that later. But this is what St. Athanasius, by 339, writes. He says that the Lenten fast was a fast, quote, that the whole world observed, end quote. So when people, especially Protestants, allege Catholics don't, observe the faith the way that the early church did, and they're going back to it, that's simply false. Because in the very early church, we had the Lenten fast practice with great austerity. And all Christians were known to be partaking in that, and there was no one trying to exempt themselves. The canons of the Council of Nicaea in 325 also reference a 40-day Lenten period of fasting. Also notably, this is something that's interesting, is when we're talking about fasting, we're usually referring, only eating one meal and maybe a few minor meals, as we might say it. That's not how it was practiced in the early church. I'll talk about that in a second. But also, abstinence also differed from how we might think of it. In the very early church, when they said abstinence, they also very specifically meant you could not drink wine on a day of abstinence. And the reason of that is quite interesting, because they believed that they had to take away the consolations which God gave to Noah. So Noah was the first one to eat meat. We take away that consolation. He was the first one to be able to make wine, to drink it. We must take away that consolation. So abstinence was to bring man back to the diet that he had before the consolations of God after the great flood. And that is how, in the very early church, it was practiced. It's important to note that when I say abstinence, I'm referring to vegan abstinence. The notion that you could have fish to the early Christians was absurd. We associate so much with seafood being on Fridays or during Lent. That was not the case. It was not until the 6th century that fish was allowed to be had on the day of abstinence. It was over 500 years when the thought of fish on Friday would have been forbidden. And it was not until the 10th century that shellfish became allowed, because that was considered too extravagant. So also the Protestants who allege, and you might hear about this, maybe people have questions, that the early church was made up of fishermen and they wanted to enrich themselves, so they instituted these days of abstinence because they wanted to sell a lot more fish. Well, that's just not true, because they weren't eating fish. In fact, they were eating very little at all. And it was not at a time when they had Impossible burgers or anything else they could substitute. That when they said vegan, they meant basically dry vegetables and bread, and that's all you're eating. And over time, that became 2/3 of the year. People were also much healthier back then. So there's a lot, I go over more into the book that I wrote on the medical benefits of fasting that we have no time to get into here today. But there's much that can be said about physical and mental benefits from it too. Another thing I'll note is that in the very, very early church, and this is when we see, I do believe from my research, that the Muslims stole fasting from us, because the robust fasting that they do really imitated the fasting that we did. Because in the very early church, your meal could not be had until after the sunset. It was a day of fasting. The sun had to set, because that was the imitation of the Jewish tradition, that it was not allowed to have your meal until after the sunset. But the other thing, and I think it's a quite powerful story, and it's an example that, I talked about the catechism and examples. Now this is an example I would talk about. And this goes to show you how important our forefathers observed fasting and abstinence. And that is, in the very early church, water was not allowed to be had on a day of fasting or abstinence until you had your meal. No water allowed. And we know this from certain historical accounts, because when I did a lot of this research to make this teachings compiled in a way that's easy for teachers and priests to teach about it and share about it, and most importantly observe some of it, I went through a lot of historical records. There's one very powerful story in Father Alban Butler's Lives of the Saints. And this is what he says. He says, quote, Saint Fructuxus, the holy bishop of Tarragon in Spain, in the persecution of Valerian in the year 259, was being led to his martyrdom on a Friday at 10 o'clock in the morning. And he refused to drink the water which he was offered as a consolation while he was on his road to his execution, because he said it was not the hour to break the fast. So though fatigued with imprisonment and standing in need of strength to sustain himself during those conflicts of his last agony to die as a martyr, he famously said, quote, "It is a fast. I refuse to drink it. It is not yet the 9th hour. Death itself shall not oblige me to abridge my fast." That's not somebody looking for an exemption. That is the devotion that we've lost. Another thing to note, I go over this in much more detail later, he refers to the 9th hour, the way that the Romans counted time. The 6th hour was the first hour, that was 6 a.m., and so the 9th hour he's referring to 3 o'clock, because on certain days, like on Ember days, the fast was broken at a slightly different time, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, versus the weekday fast. So there's some important things that be said regarding the time, but the point is, in the very early church, you wouldn't have water at certain times. So in the very early church, we had those periods, the weekly devotional fast, of which he's dying on a Friday throughout the year, and he still won't even drink water. And then we also have the Lenten fast, which was originally practiced for catechumens, and all of us wanted to join it, so we did. But by the year 500, we have other fasts as well. We have the Advent fast starting then. It's not as ancient as the Holy Week fast, but it's definitely historic because we have record of it at least back to the year 480. When we see St. Perpetuus writing about it, and he refers to that the faithful should fast 3 times a week from the feast of St. Martin, that is St. Martin of Tours, whose feast day is November 11th. They should fast from that until Christmas. And that period became known as St. Martin's Lent. And I regularly go around and tell that to people and try to get people at parishes to voluntarily do some sort of penance in Advent of fasting, because when you fast for something, you look forward to something more. You know, Christmas means a bigger deal when it's not just commercialization. Well, it means even more when you're fasting and you're waiting for dinner, you know, for all that time. So it really is like a second Lent. But more than that, we also had the Apostles' Fast, which originated in the early church, and it would have been practiced right now as we're coming up to the Feast of Saints Peter and Paul at the end of the month. It was a period of preparation for us to fast in honor of the Apostles, St. Peter and Paul. And in fact, many in the Eastern Orthodox Church still keep that fast. And they keep what they call St. Martin's Lent as the Advent fast. They frequently refer to that as the Nativity fast. So if you find that online, many times the Orthodox are one of the very few still keeping some of those older traditions. So all of that goes back to the early church. But it didn't stop there. By the Middle Ages, you know, the fast which began under the apostles themselves for Lent was practiced in various forms before it became uniform. And at the time of St. Gregory the Great in the 7th century, the fast was universally established to begin on what we now know as Ash Wednesday. But it was not called Ash Wednesday until about the year 1099. Beforehand, it was just called, this is the beginning of the fast day. And everybody knew that was the day in which you began the fast. Historical records also further indicate that Lent was not a merely regional practice, which observed only in Rome, but it was part of the universality of the Church. Lenten fasting began in England, for instance, during the king of his time, and he went on, many of these kings really emphasized how important it was to observe these laws, and their citizens too. So it wasn't just the church saying this. Civil authorities strongly enforced these laws as well. One of the first big changes, though, to occur to fasting, so we have centuries of this is what we do. We fast with all this austerity every single week, Wednesdays, Fridays, sometimes Saturdays, Lenten fast, and we got to fast before Christmas. We got to fast in June. We also have the Ember days, which occur on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays and throughout the different seasons, to mark those seasons, to offer those to God, to pray for new priests. So this is, you know, going back to the very early church. But one of the first big changes we had was the introduction in the 8th century of collations. And what that basically was you could have food more than once a day. So the rules on fasting remained largely the same for hundreds of years. Food was to be taken only once after sunset. You would have your meal and you would be done. You wouldn't eat all night. It was when your meal's done, you're done. And then the fast resumed. But it came about in the year 817 when the monks of the Benedictine order, who did so much for laboring in the fields to bring about the cultivation of farms, and as we know in Europe now, they were allowed to be given a little bit of a drink in the evening and a morsel of bread to sustain their strength for the next day. Eventually, the church extended those laws to the laity as well, and by the end of the medieval times, they became universally practiced. Almost everybody ate a little bit of food in the very early evening, and the meal was thus moved up to about 3 o'clock, so it was no longer after sunset. Around this time, they said, well, our Lord himself died at 3 in the afternoon. That is the hour in which we will have the meal. And then the evening, you can have this small little morsel and perhaps a small drink of something. And that's all you could have. That was really the first kind of crack in the foundation when people started to change these rules. Now, the Lenten fast by the time of St. Thomas Aquinas was like this. This is just the Lenten fast, so listen to this. Mondays through Saturdays were fasting. The meal was taken at 3 o'clock, and that collation was allowed at night. No meat whatsoever was to be allowed, and no animal products were allowed. So it's still vegan. So you can't have butter, you can't have dairy, you can't have cream, anything like that. Abstinence from these foods, most importantly, remained even on Sundays of Lent when they were forbidden to be eaten. So while fasting was not practiced on Sundays, abstinence was still mandatory on Sundays. That's why Fat Tuesday was such a big deal. That was literally your last time to go out and have all this food. And in the very early church like this, people would celebrate. By the time it was getting close to midnight and you had all this leftover butter or milk or that, you just take it outside and throw it away on the ground because it's not going to be refrigerated. And you're definitely not going to consume it because that's a serious sin to violate the laws of the church. So you went and threw it away. It was your last day of merriment. And it was really practiced with a Christian intention initially. Unfortunately, not the same anymore. Now also, though, this is again the Lenten fast by the time of St. Thomas Aquinas. No food whatsoever, though, was to be taken, if possible, on Ash Wednesday or Good Friday. So not just the one meal. Don't eat anything at all. And Holy Week, though, was a more intense fast. You could only eat bread, salt, drink water, and you could put herbs on your bread, and that was all you could eat. There's a technical name for that. And I won't go into that, but basically referred to dry eating. You could only eat things that were dry. You weren't allowed to cook it. It was an additional form of mortification. And that was the Lenten fast at the time of St. Thomas Aquinas. Of course, when people talk about fasting being hard now, you just think about, wow, not very hard now at all. Now, by the 14th century, the meal had began to move up even more, and it became common to have it at 12 o'clock in the afternoon. That's when you had your meal on a fasting day, and you could still have that morsel in the evening. So for a long time, if you look at some of these older catechisms that I'm referencing, and talking about what hour do you break the fast, most of them are going to say noon, because that is what it was for a long time by the 14th century on. But what is commonly not taught is how interesting it is that we even call 12 o'clock noon. And most people don't really think about where that particular phrase comes from. And it actually comes from our history in fasting as well. Because what would happen is, a lot of priests and monks, they have to say the divine office. They have to say these prayers throughout the day. And it was stipulated in the laws of the church that they not only had to wait for a certain time to break their fast, they could not break their fast until they completed the divine office prayers of the day. So what would happen is they would eventually move up the meal and they would move up these prayers. So noon, as we would know it as non, was typically referred to as the third hour in the afternoon, ninth hour, 3 o'clock. And when they moved it up to noon, they still had to say the prayer of non, and then they would have their meal, and it entered into our English language as noon because they had finished the prayers of non at 12 o'clock. So that's why we call 12 o'clock noon, because as soon as they would finish, then you could eat your meal. So that's where it comes from. Also in the Middle Ages, abstinence from meat on Fridays and during Lent was not only church law, it was civil law as well. We see that as well, actually, even in the royal decrees issued in England, even after Henry VIII, everything he did to bring about the demise of the true faith in England. There was a number of decrees continued throughout the 1500s and 1600s indicating that abstinence from meat was not only to continue to be done by the new Church of England, but to sell meat or to consume it would be illegal in England for quite a long time. And in fact, they remained on the books officially until they were removed in 1863, even though they were no longer enforced after 1687. So I think all that history is important, because when people ask us questions about how did fasting and abstinence change, how was it like, did the early church practice it, how was it in the Middle Ages, it's important to understand some of this history to understand why meal times are what they are, or why now we have one meal on a fasting day and two smaller meals that don't equal the meal, as people would say, even though I think that's a little disingenuous to define that as such. I like to refer to the technical terms on that, the collation, and then I'll talk about the other one in a minute. But I also want to mention that even with these changes, every country and every diocese, you had some variation as well. So for instance, in Ireland, the once great Catholic nation of Ireland maintained a prohibition on all meat on Wednesdays throughout the year, Wednesdays, much longer than any other nation. In fact, they continued to prohibit it until the middle of the 17th century, that no Catholic there would think to eat meat on a Wednesday. And that was what Catholic Ireland was really known for. But one of the biggest changes to fasting and abstinence that I will really highlight, because this is when we start going into the modern crisis that I feel like we've encountered with fasting and abstinence, with people want exceptions to everything, really came about in 1741. And this is a picture of Pope Benedict XIV. He reigned from 1740 to 1758. And on May 31st, 1741, Pope Benedict XIV granted permission to eat meat on fasting days for the very first time in the church, a very important historical moment that people are not often taught. So for instance, before I said there was no meat at all had during Lent. This was the very, very, very first time the notion that there could be any day in Lent in which meat is had began in 1741, when he granted permission to eat meat on fasting days, but he explicitly prohibited the consumption of fish and flesh meat on that same day. So he did not like surf and turf. It was very common that people at that time would try to do both. And I don't know why, I've never really understood why he was so adamant that you could not have fish and meat in the same meal. But for a long time, if you look at the older catechism, they talk about how important it was. So that's the understanding why, was what he's writing about at that time. Now, the notion that you could have meat on a fasting day just at the main meal and not at the other smaller meals that were just really snacks, that is where this started, and that was called partial abstinence. That's something nobody really talks about now, but it was definitely in all of our historical things through really the 1917 Code. The concept of partial abstinence would not appear until the 1917 Code, but it basically is referring to this, that you can eat meat at the one meal, but don't have fish with it, even though that subsequently changed after too. But what I'd like to highlight regarding Benedict XIV is this. He says, "The observance of Lent is the very badge of Christian warfare. By it we prove ourselves not to be enemies of the cross of Christ. By it we avert the scourges of divine justice. By it we gain strength against the princes of darkness, for it shields us with heavenly help. Should mankind grow remiss in their observance of Lent, it would be a detriment to God's glory, a disgrace to the Catholic religion, and a danger to Christian souls. Neither can it be doubted that such negligence would become the source of misery to the world, of public calamity, and of private woe." So he's emphasizing here how important it is. If you're a Catholic, if you claim to follow our Lord's religion, then you have to have a robust fasting life, how important it is. And if we give it up, it's going to be not only to the detriment of us, but to the whole society. But at the same time, he's got this pressure around him by other people who want these exceptions, and they eventually give in. He says, okay, you can have meat certain days. That was a major crack in the foundation. And I know a lot of this, sometimes maybe it's not the most interesting listen to all these dates and things, but it's important to understand the context of why we have something now is you had a very robust life of fasting and abstinence practice with vigor, and then you just had people chipping away at it. And this was, people pressured him and he gave in, although he did give this beautiful reflection on how important the Lenten fast really is. Now, on to American fasting, something a little bit more applicable to us now. Is, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, there was a great divergence of fasting amongst people in America for a long time because it really depended on what colony you came from. It also depended on other specifics as well. So, for instance, Pope Paul III in 1537 famously reduced the amount of days of fasting and abstinence and those of which you had to hear Mass for Native Americans, only Native Americans. He said out of pastoral concern due to the physically demanding lifestyle they already lived and largely due to the fact that he said they already fasted so much and they had to go to Mass less days than other people. So they had different holy days of obligation. Another thing that I did in the research of my book is I went through countries like the Philippines, where a lot of this applied to them. And there were different rules. If you were a native there, you had different rules than if you were a descendant of a Spaniard and a native, then you had different ones. If you were a Spaniard who moved there, you had different rules. So there is a lot of complexity regarding fasting and abstinence. People don't realize. People just associate everybody has the same days in the church. That is not the case at all. It completely depended on a number of specifics. And that goes to show you how interesting it is here. And in fact, something that I feel like is very often not mentioned is that fasting and abstinence is not practiced to a great descent in the Hispanic world. Not a lot of emphasis down there whatsoever on it. And the reason for this also is due to a historical oddity, because in the year 1089, Pope Urban II granted a special dispensation to Spain where you did not have to observe abstinence even on certain Fridays in virtue of the Spanish efforts in the crusade against the Moors. He did that as a reward for their contributions. And after the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, most people don't know, but Pope St. Pius V, the same one behind the Roman Catechism, he expanded that privilege and said it applies to all Spanish colonies in the world. So when Spain is going here to the New World and is going into all these territories that, become Hispanic territories, then it begins to apply to them. So the dispensation took over there. And this is something interesting. You can find the newspaper online about this. But the very last diocese here in the United States that invoked this dispensation and said they did not have to have special meals on Fridays for Catholics was the Archdiocese of Santa Fe, New Mexico. When it was not until 1951 that the bishop there came out and he said that he was finally rescinding that privilege, the very last place to do so. And the newspaper actually talked about how Catholics, they were confused. They were going to have to stop eating their regular meals they eat on every other day. They were going to have to switch to a different diet. And that was 1951. So there's a total different patchwork here, even in the United States. And that's also one of the reasons why we had that unification in 1885 with the Council of Baltimore to come up with not only a catechism, but also a universal understanding of fasting and abstinence. What I share here is also interesting because I feel like this is something that doesn't get discussed a lot as well. And that is when we talk about the church's laws. This is regarding the law of hearing Mass on Sundays and holy days of obligation. There is no longer a distinction in this, but for a very long time, there were days of double or single precepts. So I mention this because you might find these in older catechisms too, and you don't know what that means. Now, double versus single precept means if it's only single precept, that means you have to go to Mass that day, but that means you can go to work after if you want. If it's a double precept, you can't do servile work either, so you need to take the whole day off. So that is really what this is showing. And it's also going to show you how even in Ireland this is changing over time. Certain days are different. You might be shocked, but those are all the different holy days of obligation, because in the Universal Church, we went back to really 1641, there were 36 holy days of obligation in 1641. And not every place kept them. Some places actually somewhat had even more afterwards. So that is why we have this great reduction. We had many different ones beforehand. Now, going over, though, American fasting in a little bit more detail, one thing that I mentioned early on today is that abstinence also included not just Fridays here in America, but Saturdays, and that did not change until 1833, when the Second Council of Baltimore, the U.S. bishops, came out with a pastoral letter, and they said Catholics here in America no longer had to fast and abstain on Saturdays. So that's something that most people don't know about at all. If you look at the Dewey Catechism, though, it goes over in detail the importance of Saturday abstinence. That's something that I encourage people to do. So when we get into application ideas, that's something I want you to keep in mind. What other days of abstinence can you voluntarily observe, not under penalty of sin, but in order to make up for your own sins and to offer for students? And one of the things that I personally do is I don't eat meat, of course not on Fridays, but also I don't on Saturdays. Because I thought if Catholics can go for centuries and not eat meat on Saturdays, that would be a great way for me to unite with my ancestors and my forefathers and to have an additional day of penance. And it also allows people to prepare better for Sunday Mass, when you look forward to it a bit more. So that's something you might voluntarily choose to do at least certain Saturdays of the year. But that history on how it was required for a long time is something that most people don't know about. As the other thing that people don't know about is that Sundays in Lent were not anything goes days. They were for a very long time period in which you could not eat meat at all. It really was not until the time of Leo XIII, at the very end of the 1800s, the notion that you could have meat or animal products on Sundays in Lent originated. Beforehand, it was not the case. So some people now feel like it's Sunday, you don't need to do any penance at all during Lent. That's some people even take it further to say it would be wrong to do any penance on Sunday in Lent. That's not true. Because for a long time it was mandatory to do abstinence on Sundays in Lent. So just something to keep in mind. Whenever you teach people, people come up with things. How do you honor the Lord's Day? What is required, what is not? There's nothing wrong with abstaining on Sunday, because in fact it was required for a very long time. I unfortunately have heard teachers say that it would be a sin to abstain on Sunday. And that's not true, because that means the church would have required sin for centuries, which would be absurd. So there were a number of different changes which occurred from Leo XIII on, and I won't go over all of them, but I do want to quote from the Baltimore Manual of 1884, because I think it's quite interesting. So not that long ago in the grand scheme of things. The Baltimore Manual of 1884 really stipulated in a very easy to follow way what do we mean about practicing fasting and abstinence. As an American Catholic, this was what it says, quote, "Only one full meal is allowed to be taken about noon or later. Besides this full meal, a collation of 8 ounces is allowed. If the full meal is taken about the middle of the day, the collation may be taken in the evening. If the full meal is taken late in the day, the collation may be taken at noon. Besides the full meal and a collation, a general custom has made it lawful for the faithful to take up to 2 ounces of bread, but never with butter, and a cup of some warm liquid, such as coffee or tea in the morning. This is important to observe, for by means of this many persons are enabled and therefore obliged to keep the fast who would otherwise not be able to do so." So that's the Baltimore Manual. You might be surprised. It's not just saying, eat a meal and eat some other things. No, it literally said, weigh them to make sure they're not too much. So for a long time, collations were noted as only 8 ounces of food. That's why, if you remember, it's not really been that long ago that Christmas Eve was a day of fasting. And a lot of people don't remember that, but it was called the joyful fast of Christmas Eve because the church said you didn't have to do 8 ounces, you could double it. You could have 16 ounces. So it was called the double collation of Christmas Eve. And St. Alphonsus even talks about that. If you read his things, he's talking about the joyful fast and the double collation. He's referring to that special exception on Christmas Eve that you otherwise might have not known about. But when you understand the context in which things happen, you can understand why it matters. Now, there were a number of fasting changes that occurred at the end of the 1890s. There were different privileges called the working men's privilege that was given by the bishops in the United States, so that way people could eat meat, especially they had difficulty in observing the law of fasts on certain days. It applied sometimes to the family of the working men. There were different exceptions to sailors or people who went off to World War I, and if you came back, and as well as your families as well. But significant changes really began to occur in a strong way under the time of St. Pius X. So this is a graphic, too, I also made, because sometimes a lot of this you can get lost in some of the finer details, but if we just look here, you can kind of see how over time things have really changed. You can see these different councils or these different episodes in history, and this is just for Lent too, but the different characteristics of the fast. You can see how that changed over time. When was meat first allowed? When was fish first allowed? When was fish not allowed with the meat? Then when could it be separated? The time of the meal. Different indults as well. So that's important to understand that when people say what fasting used to be like, you'll hear about that all the time. People might ask questions what it used to be like. Well, what are you talking about when? Because it was like many different things over many different periods of time, and it also depends who you were. Because as I said before, there were different exceptions to different people. So this is a helpful chart that I made so that way people could have some sort of a reference aid, so that way you can see how it changes over time. Now, significant changes, though, occurred with the 1917 Code of Canon Law. So many people are aware that St. Pius X did much to champion the liturgy and to make Holy Communion more accessible to people, to lowering the age for Holy Communion, but he also did a lot of simplification with fasting and abstinence and holy days, and unfortunately, due to some of that, some of these other practices have been lost. So for instance, beforehand, if you had a vigil and you had to have it on, and it was a fasting vigil. If it fell on a Sunday, you don't fast on Sundays, you move it to Saturday. He said, don't worry about that. You don't have to do that anymore. So that was dropped. Along also with the 1970 Code of Canon Law, Wednesdays and Fridays of Advent were no longer fasting days. Most people don't realize beforehand, even in America, Wednesdays and Fridays of Advent were fasting. So that was really only universally dropped about 100 years ago. And Wednesdays in Advent had previously been dropped in America in 1837, but we kept the Fridays longer, so they were gone by that point. This was also the very first time, this is 1917, when eggs and milk could universally be consumed during Lent for the first time by anybody. You didn't have special exceptions for certain countries, that this was the very first time you could have that year-round. And also year-round Saturday abstinence, which was practiced in many other countries even after it was dropped in America, ceased universally only in 1917. So in the grand scheme of things, in the grand scheme of Catholic history, that's not that long ago. That's only about 100 years. We talk about 2,000 years. That's important to understand how it's relatively recent when people say, well, we don't do that. I don't think we've ever done that. Well, we've done it for a long time. And I just want people to understand that a lot of these things that we've lost and people think we've never had, it's just because people aren't taught it. And it's important to teach other people. So one thing that I'll highlight from the changes that occurred in the middle of the 1900s was Halloween. Many people might, if you're old enough, might still remember Halloween used to be a day of fasting and abstinence for Catholics because it was the day before All Saints' Day. It was the vigil of All Saints, and it was one of those important vigil days. And that was dropped in 1951 to only partial abstinence, and some years later, it was dropped altogether. In 1957, Pope Pius XII, he moved the vigil from, beforehand you always had a fast on the day before Our Lady's Assumption, and he moved that. That actually went back to the very early church. That was one of those vigils that was practiced for a long time. He moved that to December 7th. And then that was the day before the Immaculate Conception. So again, when you're looking at some older catechisms and it's referring to days of fasting, it also depends on when it's printed, because there was actually a lot of changes that are occurring between 1900 and the 1960s. So that is something I would want to draw everybody's attention to. And this is another graphic that I made just to highlight some of those changes in vigils over time. So that way you can see it differ by country. Over the years, different things were moved. It can be difficult to keep it all in mind. But again, the losing of things is what I want to leave you with. We had a robust life of fasting, and we didn't only do it because somebody said you have to do it. If you don't do it, it's a sin. People said, I want to have those three elements of fasting. I want to bridle the lusts of the flesh. I want to raise my mind to contemplate heavenly things and free my time. And I want to make satisfaction for sin. And the church has over time changed who and how this is observed. But it was always practiced in certain extents, maybe more robustly at times than others. But it was entirely lost. But we can restore fasting. We can restore it in our families, and we can restore it in our own practice. And we can do so over time. This image here is of the consecration of St. Patrick's Cathedral. And this is also, until the 1960s, something most people didn't realize, that if you had a new parish made, you petitioned, the petition was granted, the church was built, and the bishop's coming tomorrow to consecrate it. Not only the priest, but all the faithful who brought about that desire and petition for that parish to be created were ordered by the law of the church you must observe a fast the day before he comes, so that you can spiritually prepare for that to be consecrated to God. And that is another historical thing that nobody really is ever taught anymore, how important it is for our own parishes to realize, well, if we celebrate the anniversary of the consecration of this parish on a certain day, maybe we should observe a fast in honor of the whole parish too voluntarily the day before, because our ancestors who built this church, they did that before it was consecrated. But it's important to know that as Catholics, part of the rhythm and rhyme of Catholic life is not just holy days of obligation and feast days, but it's fasting days as well. What have we gained from this slow erosion of holy days and fasting days over time? Most importantly, while no authority in the church can change or alter any dogmatic definitions of the faith, no infallible teachings can ever change, the discipline of holy days of obligation and fasting days can change. But we do so very carefully and very slowly over time. So for instance, we don't abstain from meat on Fridays because meat is somehow unclean or evil. In fact, there's some pagan religions that believe that believe we can't eat certain food like this meat because demons hide in there, and if we eat it, we accidentally eat the demon. That is not what we're talking about. This is what Father Michael Mueller says in his 1874 Catechism of Christian Doctrine, quote, "It's not the food, but the disobedience that defiles a man," end quote. I think that's key. Whenever you're talking about fasting and abstinence, remember, it's all about obedience. That's what it's going back to. We have to obey the church, and we have to obey when the church says that we can and can't do things. That doesn't mean we can't do or shouldn't do or want to do more, but we have to do certain things as a bare minimum. And the failure to do so is the act of disobedience. As I mentioned at the very beginning, the first commandment of God was violated, and it was one of fasting. It was one of disobedience against fasting. So on a similar note, bishops, for instance, could lawfully abrogate the precept of hearing Mass on Sundays or other holy days, and while no bishop can dispense from the obligation of honoring the holy day, which is a matter of divine law, the fact is that matters of discipline can change. But there's a clear distinction between doctrine and discipline. Yet even with this distinction, the Church has historically been very slow to change over time, these disciplines. So this is what Fulton Sheen once said. He said, quote, "It is a long-established principle of the Church never to completely drop from her public worship any ceremony, any object or prayer which once occupied a place of prominence in that worship." Now the same could really be said for matters concerning days of fasting and abstinence as well, that we shouldn't just get rid of them all, but we should retain them. What our forefathers held sacred should remain sacred to us. In an effort to persevere our Catholicity not only with ourselves and one another, but our ancestors who are now in heaven with God, we hope, and they look down upon us. And I'm afraid that in many respects they look down, they don't recognize us, because the life of fasting that they practiced was so robust that it would be an insult to many of them. Perhaps we now need to ask ourselves and our families what we can do physically in our own ability, whatever our ability is, understand that first and foremost, and then understand based on that, what can we do that's beyond what the church requires? How can we rediscover these former holy days of obligation and fasting days? How can we cultivate a devotion to honor these many former holy days of obligation by additional prayer and leisure or assisting at the church's liturgy on those days? And likewise with fasting and abstinence. What can we do? So for instance, this next Lent, you might want to observe all of Lent other than Sundays as days of fasting, if you haven't. You might want to observe everything during Lent, even Sundays as days of abstinence from meat. Or maybe you want to ease in and say, okay, well, that's too hard on my family, but I can definitely do Wednesdays, of course Fridays, but I'll do Wednesdays and Saturdays as extra. So you can find ways to incorporate that in a greater degree. And I can speak firsthand how important it is for priests to know that people are making sacrifice to them. So in our own parishes, obviously our priests are under great need. Same thing with our students too. We can offer this up for them. So it would be much easier, I feel like, if you're doing additional penance, you've had somebody in mind. You literally had their picture in mind, and I'm offering this for you. You know, it's one thing to say I'm offering prayers for somebody, and you should. But then you say, I want to offer you a decade of the rosary, then you go about your day, and then honestly, you know, you're going to forget about it. You did that, you observed it, you made sure to pray for them. It's not the same, though, as fasting, because you're going to be hungry, and you're going to be thinking about them, and that is a sacrifice worth doing. But in many respects, the things that are the most beneficial to us are the hardest to do. And that is why, in many respects, I can say this after having run many marathons, and I have many more lined up that I'm planning to run, that fasting really is a marathon, and that we do so because it's hard, and we understand not everybody can do it in some extent, but we can do it to some extent. We don't have to do 2/3 of the year, but you can work your way up to do more, because it is a powerful tool and means at your disposal if you want to make a difference in the lives, for instance, of your students, to have one of them in mind every time you fast. So for ideas, I would suggest the 40 days of Lent or the days of Advent. So specifically Wednesdays and Fridays, because those used to be days of fasting in Advent for a long time here in America. We could do the vigils of major feasts. We could do the Ember days, the Rogation days. All of those provide us a great opportunity to fast in conformity with our Catholic history, but to do so with the intention of our students in mind. This is what St. Francis de Sales said. He said, if you're able to fast, you will do well to observe some days beyond those required by the Church. And he's saying that at a time when it was still robustly practiced to a much greater extent now. So he's writing this hundreds of years ago. And he's saying if you can still do more, you would be good to do more. Of course, don't go all in. I talk about in my book a lot of things about, don't be overly ambitious. That's like going from I never run to I run a marathon this weekend. You're not going to run the marathon. You might try. You're not going to complete the marathon, but you have to ease into it. So if you don't fast a lot, you don't abstain a lot, ease in, of course, all year long, all Fridays, no meat. Start that, of course, is the base minimum. Then go into making your Lent more robust. And then after that, I would look at Wednesdays, I would look at Fridays throughout the year, and other vigils as well to add in. That's a roadmap for you to think about that. And especially as the school year is going on and you have these different days coming up, these are great teaching opportunities to talk about what people used to fast on this day, the day before the Immaculate Conception, because how important the Immaculate Conception really is. This is a great teaching opportunity for you to lead by example and to, most importantly, make a great difference into the lives of your students, because there are priests I know out there who say they can really physically feel the difference when people are fasting for them, that it makes a difference. Because as St. Basil the Great said, it is a protection against demons. And demons continue to persecute priests. Of course, they persecute us and anybody, but priests are under a significant amount of attack. So obviously for priests, for bishops, for everybody in a teaching authority, need all the more prayers and sacrifices. And sometimes people don't know what they mean by sacrifices. Well, fasting and abstinence is the primordial sacrifice that we can make for our priests. So that is a overview, brief, of the history of fasting and abstinence. A lot more dates and information. If you're interested in the book, I have a couple copies, and I have more information online about that if you'd like to learn more. But it's a subject I just feel like most people don't know, because it's something that most priests aren't even taught. But what I can give you is, I'm going to give you about 15 or so minutes for the next activity. So the next activity is, as I talked about at the beginning, I'd like you to come up with, one, a list of names of people who you can actually fast for, and two, think about ways that you can fast. So of course, fasting and absence, maybe not everybody is physically able to fast or needs to ease into it. So think about that, but think about which days that you can fast more. Think about for your students, especially if it's related to a student's birthday or a family member's birthday or the anniversary of somebody in your family who's passed away, great days to put on the calendar. So that's the activity, to try to, make it concrete and to make it livable. So when I say fasting, I mean one meal, preferably only one meal. You can have those 2 snacks, of course, though. And if it's a fasting day, it's also an absence day by definition. Not all days of absence are days of fasting, but all days of fasting would be days of abstinence. So that's something to keep in mind. So that's something to write down. The second of which is, if you have your laptops or your phone, to go back to the link tree that I put out, and there's going to be a link on there. It says, to the definitive guide to Catholic fasting and abstinence. And that's going to be a collection of articles that I wrote on the topic for all different things. So I want that to be a resource to you. If you have somebody who has questions on why do we fast at certain times, what kind of liquids were allowed on fasting days, what is the Eucharistic fast? I didn't even talk about that, but that has a whole separate section. The calendar is mentioned in there, everything else. So that's a resource for you to find links, to download things, and to save files, and to share it around. But spend some time exploring that, and then think about, again, the people and the dates. And then maybe some people can share some things that they've come up with after the 15. Thanks.